Hey guys, I'm Abby, and welcome back to One Code Camp channel. Today, we are going to talk about MongoDB Driver. We are going to make an application code and learn how to connect that to our database using MongoDB Driver. Let's do it! So far in our MongoDB series, we've been talking about MongoDB and what it is all about. We have learned the CRUD operations and relationships in MongoDB. And we've been doing all of these inside MongoDB Compass and MongoDB Shell. In creating an application, we have our application code and our database. And unless we are purely in charge of the database and MongoDB alone, we are not only going to make use of this in the web app that we are building if there is nothing to connect our database to our code. So, how do we do that? For us to interact our MongoDB to our application code, we need to make use of specific MongoDB driver. And for each environment or programming language, we also need a specific driver. Before we move forward, let's look at the list of drivers that are available for a different programming language. For that, let's go to the MongoDB site, mongodb.com. Let's go to Resources here on the top nav, then select Drivers. We will be presented with these selections, and we can select whatever driver that we need. For our MongoDB series, we are going to be making a Node API, so we will be using the Node driver to connect our Node application to our MongoDB. Let's click on node.js. Once we've done that, it's going to show us this page, and let's click the download and install link, and let's go through these steps. First, since we will be using MongoDB in a Node application, let's first go to nodejs.org and install it on your computer. Additionally, we should also know the basics about how Node applications work and how to make a simple Express app. If you haven't used or worked with Node and Express before, I highly recommend you learn them first. We also have a Node and Express series in our One Code Camp channel. All right. Let's create project directory. Let's open up terminal. In my case, I'm going to use git bash. Right. Let's create a folder. So that's mkdir, then the name of our folder. Here, the name is node_quickstart, but we can name it whatever we want. So for this one, I'm going to call it Mongo Driver and hit on enter. Then let's go to that folder, cd Mongo Driver, and let's open that in our code editor. That will be VS Code in my case. You can also use whatever code editor you are comfortable with, but in my case, I'm going to use this. Then in here, let's open up a terminal. So I'm going to use git bash again. And run the command that is in our mongodb.com download and install steps, which is npm init-y. Let's copy that and paste that in here. All right, let's enter that. So here we are running the command npm init to initialize our Node.js project, then the -y flag to say yes to all the default values. It's going to create a package.json file, which will keep track of all of our dependencies. After that, we can now install the MongoDB driver for Node by typing in the command that is right here in the steps. So let's copy that and paste it in our terminal. Let's hit on enter. Let's wait for that to load and for it to install. And once that's done, let's check it in our package.json. And just like that, we have installed it successfully. And this one right here is what we are going to be using to connect to our MongoDB database. Now that we have completed these steps, let's create a file for our project, and let's call it app.js. Here is where most of our code is going to go, and we are going to create an Express app in here. Before we can do that, there are also a few things we have to install. First, let's install Express by typing in the command npm install express --save to save this to our dependencies. Then let's check that again in our package.json. And there it is. Inside our code, let's first require express. So that's const express require express. Then, let's initialize the app by invoking our function, which is the require express. Then, we need to listen to requests. Again, if you haven't done any Express apps, or if you've forgotten about how it works, you can check our dedicated series for Node and Express as well. Okay, listen to requests, which is going to be on a specific port number. So let's use app, then the method listen, and specify the port number that we want to listen to. Up here, let's put another variable for port and specify it as 3000. So later on, when we view this in our browser, it will be on our localhost port 3000, and our app is going to listen for requests to that port. Then, we can start this arrow function once we've started listening for requests. Then inside, let's do console.log to tell us that app is listening on port 3000. Okay, so once we start listening for requests, we are going to be seeing that in our console down here. After that, we need the route handlers, which will be down here inside our code. First, we need the getRequest handler so that when we send a request to localhost port 3000 /, we are going to have a getRequest handler to handle that request. So for this one, let's go back and use our music library database. So here, let's type in app, then the method called get to handle a get request. So that will be app.get, then /music library. And then a callback function when the request comes in this URL, and a rec and res for request and response object inside. And for now, let's first send a response back to the one who's making the request by taking the response object and use the method called JSON to send back a JSON response. For now, let's send back a message property on an object to welcome us. So that's res.json, and then object message, and the message welcome. Okay, this is a very simple Express app, and we can make this work like this just to also check if everything is going well. We have installed Express and required it up here. We invoke that to start our app. We have used the listen method so that we can listen to the port number that we have specified up here. Lastly, we've set up our first route handler for GET requests to /music library, which will be localhost 3000 /music library. When we type that in the browser for send request, we are going to handle that by sending a response, which will be JSON that will show us this message. Now, for us to run this application and for us to see if this works, let's use NodeMon. NodeMon will allow us to create a development server and watch our file for changes. Once we have changed something in our file and save it, it's going to restart the server automatically. You can also choose not to use NodeMon, but by not using it, you'll have to keep restarting our server manually, and that will not be very practical. So to use NodeMon, we have to install it globally on our computer. To do that, let's type in our terminal npm install -g NodeMon. So -g means that we are installing it globally. Then to run NodeMon, let's type in NodeMon, then the name of the file. So for us, that will be NodeMon app. Now it shows us that app is listening to port 3000, which is in our code right here. Let's try if we change this to, for example, port 5000. Let's see that. And here we can see that it automatically run in NodeMon as well. All right, let's change that back first to 3000 before we move forward. Now, let's check that in our browser. Let's go to that address, our localhost, then the port that we have specified, which is 3000, then /music library, which we also specified in our handler function for the GET request. We should get that JSON response right here. Next thing that we want to do, instead of just sending back this JSON response, we will be communicating with MongoDB using the Node driver. To start, let's create a new file and let's call it connection.js. We are creating a new file to separate our connection code from the app.js for better file and folder structure and to have a cleaner code. But if you wish, you can do all of these inside the app.js as well. In this file, let's import the module. So that's const mongo client require MongoDB. Mongo client is a class that allows us to make connections to MongoDB. There is another way of writing this. Const mongo client require MongoDB dot mongo client. I'm just gonna leave this one right here as a comment, but you can use either of them. After that, we are going to create a function called connect. Now here, MongoDB uses a promise-based library. And here, we are going to use the async await. So let's create this async function. And we will have a try-catch method. And here, we will handle the error. And if an error occurred, we want to be able to know. So let's put that in a console.error. Let's say that an error occurred. All right. Then down here, after the try catch, let's do a finally. Finally will be executed whether the try succeeded or the error has been catched. This is to close the connection. Before we do that, let's do the try. Up here, let's create the client, and that will be the Mongo client. Inside of that, we are expected to pass in the URI string. And that string is the connection string from our database, which we will pull up from our MongoDB compass. Let's copy that. And let's create a variable called URI and paste that connection string right here inside the quotation marks. Then, pass in that URI inside of here. Inside try, we are going to create a method called client.connect. And since this method expects a promise back, we'll have to use await. So here, it is not always expected that this will be successful. This could actually fail. So what we need to do is close the connection. All right, so going back to try, after we connect, we can ask for the database. In this case, we want our music library database. And we can make it a variable called db, and we can get that db. Then we can console log that and see that we are connected to that database. Let's call that function and try that in our console. Okay, we have a connection error, and it's not letting us connect to our local host. And what I have found out is this alternative to localhost, which is 0.0.0.0. So that's 4 zeros and dots in between. Okay, we have another error here because this shouldn't be music library, but instead db.database name, because we are getting that from our db variable. And now we are successfully connected to our music library database. And we have a clean exit here because we've responsibly closed our connection in finally. Now, that's one way to do it. But let me show you another way And now we will get those information inside our database. Let's comment this out, and let's do the other way to connect to our database. We'll still be working inside our connection.js file. And in here, we are going to create two functions. And those two functions are going to be exported from this file so that we can use them in app.js later on. To export, let's type in module.exports, set that to an object, and inside we'll have two properties which will represent the two functions we want to create. The first function is a function to connect to our database. So we'll call it connect to DB. And let's just set it to an empty arrow function for now. The second function that we will create is for us to retrieve the database connection once we've already connected to our database. So that will be the second property, and we'll call it getDB. Set it equal to an arrow function as well. And we want to use the Mongo client to allow us to connect to a database, and we're going to use it inside our connect to DB function. Let's use a method on Mongo client called connect to connect to a database. And in here, we need the connection string, which again, we will get from MongoDB Compass. Copy that from there and paste that here. Then we want to specify the database name. So here, let's use music library. Later on, if we get a connection error again, we might have to change localhost to 0.0.0.0. This is an asynchronous task, which returns a promise that we can add in a then method onto to fire a function when it completes. Inside this function, we get access to a value as an argument, which we will call client, and on that client is a method called db, which returns to us the database connection. Let's store this in a variable called db connection and initialize here on top, and we're not going to assign an initial value to it, and the value will only be updated after we have connected to it. Then, if there is an error connection, we want to be able to catch it and log it to our console. This is the function for us to connect to our database, and we are going to use it later in our app.js. Now, we want to create the other function, which is getDB. We need this function so that it will return us a value of the database connection. And that value will be used to communicate with the database to do the CRUD operation, which is create, read, update, and delete. Now, this just returns us that single DB connection value. And after we've connected to the database, we'll also call this function in our app.js. Before moving forward, let's add a callback function to the connect to DB, and let's call it CB. So what we are doing right here is when we call the connect to DB function, we pass in another function that will run after the connection is established. So after the DB connection variable is updated, we can return the callback function and invoke it. And we are going to do that in the catch block as well but we'll pass in the error object. Now that we have completed our two functions, we can now use it in our app.js file. For us to be able to use those two functions, we'll have to import it right here. So that's const, and then connect db, and get db. Then require and get that from our connection.js file. Okay, let's use these functions. First, we want to connect to the database right away. So let's call the connect to DB function before we even listen to requests. So this will be an arrow function. And inside of here, if the connection was successful, that's the only time that we want to listen for requests. However, if there is an error, we don't want to establish that connection. So remember, in our connection file, whether the connection worked or not, we fire the callback function, and we also pass in the error into the callback function if there is an error in the connection. We can also accept that argument in our connect2db function in our app.js. Then in here, let's do an if statement, just to make sure that it will only execute if there is no error. What will execute? We will now listen for requests if the connection is successful. So let's just grab this app.listen function and put it inside of here. After we've successfully connected, we need the getDB function so that we can have that database connection object in this app.js file. Above our connect to DB function, let's make an empty variable and let's call it DB. And after we have connected to the database and start listening for requests, we can now update that DB variable and set it to getDB and invoke that function. Now, let's go ahead and fetch those documents inside our database. Let's use the DB variable inside the getRequestHandler function to do that. So inside of here, let's say db.collection. This collection method is used to reference a specific collection in the database, and let's pass in the collection that we need. In our case, we want the songs collection. Then let's use the find method, which will find all the documents in the songs collection. Here, the find method is a little different than when we use it in MongoDB shell. Here, the find method returns to us something called cursor, and then we can use methods on that cursor. Two methods that we can use are toArray and forEach. We use those methods on that cursor to get the documents and do something with them. We will use one of those cursor methods later, but let's use the sort method first. And we want to sort it by artist. So let's say artist, then 1. Remember that this will sort our songs collection by artist alphabetically. We can now use one of those cursor methods. Let's use the forEach method to iterate each song individually. We want each song, and with each song, we like to push it to an array. Let's create that array after we are done with this. So each time we iterate over a song, we want to add that song to the songs array. Since this is an async function, it will take some time for it to finish. So here, we can add a then method, and it will fire when our thing and for each method is complete. And here, we will send a response to the user. We can do that by using the response object, then set a status code 200, meaning that everything went well. Then the JSON response, and that JSON is the array of songs. The user will get those documents when the status code is 200. If there is an error, we can again patch that error and return a response 500, meaning server error. And this will be a JSON object error and a message that there is an error fetching data. Let's actually put that song array up here. And this is supposed to be our songs collection, not our music library database. And we won't be needing this anymore. Now let's see if that will work. Okay, we have a connection error. And this is what we said earlier, that we might need to change localhost to 0.0.0.0 again. And now it worked. Now that we are successfully connected, and our app is listening to port 3000, and our songs collection. And it will return us this JSON. It might look different on your side, and you might be wondering why mine is looking all pretty like this. That's because I have this or JSON viewer. And it is this extension right here for Chrome. It says remove from Chrome on my side, but if you don't have it yet, you can just add or install it. In our next videos. See you!